Okay, so let me start off by admitting that the title of this video is a bit hyperbolic. Of course, there are good writers out there capable of creating good fiction, but I don't think I'm just indulging the cantankerous old man within me when I say that most fiction in its various mediums is not good, and it seems to be getting worse. The fact that so many new movies coming out today are remakes that fail to even rival the originals in critical reception is just one noteworthy example of what I'm talking about. Another is the fact that comic books are what inspires the most successful cinematic productions of today. And while I guess I don't really have anything against comic books, the fact that they have become the primary source of literary inspiration for our stories is an indication that we are in a state of decline in our ability to tell stories. And this is a debate even among the film community itself, whether or not comic book movies are authentic and actual cinema, because the effect of this decline and the loss of a once great storytelling medium is felt even among those who have a vested interest in keeping that machine running. Even among genres and franchises that should be a sure thing, we find controversy and polarized opinions over the critical response to what's being put out there. The ongoing attempts to bleed profits out of franchises like Star Wars and Harry Potter are a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So in that reluctant admission that we are losing our ability to tell good original stories, it got me thinking about what it is that is essential to a good story and what is lacking in today's crop of film and stage and literature. In order to understand what makes a good and complete fictional story with a beginning, middle, and end, I think it's important for us to understand the origins of this kind of storytelling. And since I don't have the historical chops to lay this out in much detail, I will rely on the wisdom and knowledge on G.K. Chesterton, who said that romance stories are the invention of Christians. And romance in this sense isn't what we mean when we say when we talk about genres like romantic comedies. Romance in this sense means fantastical adventure stories. These kinds of stories find their origin in medieval Christian Europe, and this helped me understand what key ingredients we should be looking for in a good story, because Christian civilization introduced something entirely novel to the consciousness of humanity, which was the importance of compassion and mercy. We take these concepts for granted because we're so conditioned by them, and also because in the modern age, politicians, in attempts to try to portray themselves as benevolent overseers, have really adapted that language of compassion and mercy. So it's easy to disassociate it from its Christian origins, but it's really important to understand how foreign these concepts were to a pre-Christian world. A good example of this is found in the efforts of the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate, who is so named because of his departure away from Christianity and for his attempts to renew and rehabilitate paganism within the Roman Empire. One of the problems that Julian ran into in his attempts to encourage the populace to re-embrace the old Roman cults was the fact that Christianity was very appealing among huge portions of the citizenry because of its elevation of the common person and the poor. No other legal or religious system saw any utility in the poor and the sick, but rather saw them as burdens to be discarded. But Jesus taught us to regard the least and the last as the first within his kingdom, and that great care should be shown in loving and providing for such souls. Julian's response to this was to try to compete with the charitable works of the church by establishing his own state-based welfare system in the hopes that people would turn their affections away from the church and towards his new pagan state. So this collective concern for mercy and compassion really was a novel thing that was introduced to human consciousness through Christianity, along with romantic storytelling. So it should tell us something about what is a key ingredient in a good story, which is that it should arouse our sense of compassion. Because compassion doesn't come easily to us. For example, you could hear about some tragedy on the news and maybe acknowledge it as a tragedy, but not be personally and emotionally affected by it. Simply knowing about someone else's adversity usually isn't enough to provoke our empathy. In order to really care about someone else's story, you have to spend time getting to know them and their situation, and through that personal investment, you may actually start to experience actual compassion. Because compassion etymologically means to suffer with somebody else. It means that their pain and suffering becomes your pain and suffering. And on the face of it, why would anybody want to do that? We want to avoid pain and suffering, right? So why would we want to become personally invested in someone else who is suffering so much that their own pain and suffering unavoidably becomes our own? Looking at it from that angle, it's not hard to understand why mercy and compassion were seen as irrational and undesirable until Jesus came on the scene and told us to make these things a moral priority. And since experiencing the pain of others is so unattractive on the surface of it, we need something that can reproduce the experience of caring about someone else's struggles without it costing us too much up front. And this is what the romantic novel did. It distracted us from our own selfish preoccupations long enough so that we could turn our attention towards somebody else's story. And as it did so, it awakened the conscience of each person, each reader, with an awareness that caring about another person's struggle, even if that person isn't real, makes life a lot more interesting than if you spend all your time focusing your attention on yourself and your own personal struggles. And this is why character development is such an essential ingredient in a good story. We have to spend time getting to know believable characters and investing ourselves in their lives before they just get dumped in some exceptional conflict. This is why you'll often hear movie critics who didn't like a movie say things like, "I didn't really care about the characters or what was happening to them." We have to care about them as if they were real people, because this is what reproduces that experience of compassion. This is also why remakes and retellings of stories are ineffective in this way, because we've already invested ourselves, we're already familiar with those stories, and we've already gone through the experience of having compassion for those characters. So simply just retelling them doesn't produce the same experience the way that an original story does. This is why characters can't be mere accessories to some catastrophe or cosmic struggle, and why they can't be just mere implements of the author to provide exposition or to advance the plot forward. They have to be realistic, and their humanity has to be authentic. This is why a writer like Dostoevsky was so effective in his craft. He had such a deep understanding of human psychology, and he could portray that in the characters that he rendered in his stories. So that's why it's not enough to simply make films that feature lightsabers or magic wands or superpowers. Those things are secondary to the composition of realistic characters that we get the opportunity to spend enough time with so that we can become emotionally and compassionately invested in their stories. We want to be able to experience what it's like to have someone else's pain and struggle and adversity become our own, and then to discover that this communicates something to us about our deepest identity as human beings. So don't you think that this does raise an interesting question, which is, why is it so important for us to experience what it's like to experience someone else's pain and suffering, and why does that teach us something so profound about our own humanity? Well, I'd argue that it reveals something about the deepest mystery of reality and of the universe, which is that the ground of all being, the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover, is one whose nature it is to take upon himself the suffering of others. It's an experience of the nature of God, who is love. Love being the absolute concern for the good of the other, even at the expense of self. It's the complete abandonment of self. And the greatest summary and the greatest symbol of this essential truth of all that is the cross of Jesus Christ. Thank you so much for watching that, you guys. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing and hitting that bell if you're on YouTube, or just liking and following from wherever you are and wherever you happen to be watching this from. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, is a branding and communications company that specializes in web design and logo and branding, graphic design, videography, and communications and marketing strategy. So if you know of a parish or a diocese or a business or a ministry that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure that we can probably help them out. And be sure to check out the website, which is holdsworthdesign.com.